Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shep Steiner, Associate Professor of Modern and Contemporary Art and Theory at the School of Art at the University of Manitoba and the editor of Mosaic. Thank you for joining us today for this special lecture by political theorist Dr. Banu Bargu, who's joining us from the University of California, Santa Cruz, a lovely spot, heated and hot from what we have determined right now from weather-wise. She will also lead a Zoom seminar focusing on a section of her book, Disembodiment, tomorrow from 11 to 1 o'clock. I hope you can join us for that. Dr. Bargu's lecture is part of a series of 8 events titled Suicides, Ecocides, Untangling Futurity from Out of the Worst. Mosaic began hosting last year with visits by Doctors Michael Marder and Gary Sherbert, lectures by French post-conceptual artist Sadana Fief, the music historian Alan Clayson, and earlier in the week, Michael Krimper. All of these events are hosted on traditional territories. And here I would like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses and research spaces are located on original lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Ininewak, the Anasininewak, Dakota Ayate, Dene, and Inuit, and on the homelands, the national homelands of the Red River Métis. UM recognizes that the treaties signed on these lands are a lifelong, enduring relationship, and we are dedicated to upholding their spirit and intent. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and the present. With this understanding, we commit to supporting Indigenous excellence through active reconciliation, meaningful change, and the creation of an environment where everyone can thrive. Our collaboration with Indigenous communities is grounded in respect and reciprocity, and this guides how we move forward as an institution. I would also like to acknowledge our sponsors, which include Mosaic, the Office of the President, the Faculty of Graduate Studies, the School of Art, the Departments of Religion, Sociology, Political Science, and History, and the University of Manitoba Institute for the Humanities. And so our speaker, Dr. Banu Bargu. She's a professor in the History of Consciousness program at UCSC, a fairly legendary program, I should add. She's the editor of the journal Political Theory. She's the author of Starve and Immolate, The Politics of Human Weapons, which was published by Columbia in 2014. In 2017, she edited the book Feminism, Capitalism, and Critique, Essays in Honor of Nancy Fraser, and most recently, her book Disembodiment, Corporeal Politics of Radical Refusal, which was published by Oxford University Press, won the 2025 David Easton Prize from the American Political Science Association. I would encourage you all to read this book. Many of you will know the importance of embodiment for contemporary criticism. Dr. Bargu not only uses the notion, but puts it to work in order to confront the mind-body problem at its most worrying. Her book, Disembodiment, moves on ground that is shared between one's own body and other bodies, effectively traverses the ground shared by politics and aesthetics to investigate the body as the ultimate site of resistance, a power, but something unknowable. With the specter, perhaps, of the psychoanalytic institution hovering here and there, we glimpse acts of protest that risk and, importantly, give up life and limb, not as pathological, but as singular moments of a kind of agency that must be seen against heretical philosophy of history and through the gloomy twilight that besets so many democracies today. Banu Bargu's talk today is titled Dying In. Please welcome Dr. Banu Bargu.
Thank you so much, Dr. Steiner, for that introduction. I really feel honored to be here to have this opportunity to share some new work. And apologies that I couldn't be there in person. I hope to visit sometime in the future. And I would also like to acknowledge Kate and Carolyn for making this possible. A lot of invisible work always goes into the making of these occasions, and I really appreciate that. Okay, I'm going to dive right into reading my paper, and hopefully we'll have enough time for Q&A afterwards. It's called Dying In. In the elevator that takes me to my university office, there hangs a placard that outlines the procedures to follow in case of a fire, earthquake, evacuation, medical emergency, hazardous material spill, criminal situation, or shooting. In each of these emergencies, the main advice is to stay calm, leave the immediate area if possible, and to call 911. In only one instance, however, the advice is different. In case there's a shooter and escape is not possible, the advice is to take cover, hide, or play dead until escape might become possible. This is a university building in an idyllic forest of redwood trees overlooking the Pacific Ocean, an enclave that is relatively shielded from the outside world. Nonetheless, given the fate of US schools and educational institutions to become crime scenes of shootings in a proportion greater than any other place in the world, except perhaps for active war zones, the university administration must have thought it necessary to announce to the denizens of campus how to act in case such a scenario materializes. I am very interested in this advice to play dead that is suggested as a way to survive in case of an active shooter, not only because it's different from the other situations, but also because it entails a response that may work to neutralize violence by feigning that it has already succeeded. In other words, it's a provocative performance of death to suggest the violence has already reached fruition. After all, why would a shooter keep shooting if those present are already dead? The logic of feigning death, then, is to persuade the shooter to stop by tricking them to believe that the harm they intended has already been inflicted. It offers a temporal folding forward of the event, fast forwarding to the shooter that their fatal actions have reached their logical conclusions, to convince them they have already succeeded so that they bring their assault to a halt. The same gesture reappears, though in a different context, when activists place themselves in public sites and lie on the ground, feigning dead bodies. In this striking and evocative form of protest action called the die-in, activists fill the streets with bodies that are motionless, or they mimic falling dead by a dramatized movement into the horizontal position. Sometimes coordinated in waves or concatenated to ensure maximum visibility and to avoid police intervention. Die-ins have also involved activists decorating themselves with red paint or the tracing of a chalk line around each of their bodies, suggesting that the mimicked deaths are murders and that the street is a crime scene. Finally, protesters have also vacated these chalk silhouettes, moving aside to stage other deaths to amplify the repetition that characterize the deaths that they perform. In the political gesture of playing dead, there's a similar temporal fold, but one that is in the opposite direction. Here, it is not that those who pretend dead do so to try to survive by suggesting the harm is already inflicted when it's not. It is to retroactively show how the act that was already completed but not registered as a political act, or one that was greeted with impunity, was in fact an act of irreversible harm. If there is any forward temporal fold, it is by bringing into public visibility something that has already transpired, and transpired multiple times without registering as a harm, to prevent the same harm from being repeated upon others in the future. So, we have two forms of playing dead, one to escape it, the other to name it. One to erase a presence so that it blends into the surroundings and goes unnoticed by an aggressor, the other to make visible a violence that has been done by an aggressor that goes unnoticed or unpunished. This contrast reveals the semantic space between escaping unjustified bodily harm inflicted by an aggressor and naming the infliction of bodily harm by the security forces of the state or their deliberate negligence of bodily harm until it turns into death as unjustifiable, in fact, as a form of state terror. In liberal democratic polities, that very space between the corporeal safety of the individual and the calling out of its breach by the collective force set up to protect it is the vast realm of the political. As Foucault teaches us, because the political in modern societies is always already the biopolitical, or because it is the security of life that holds the political collectivity together and gives power the legitimacy with which it can claim obedience, both forms of playing dead at the same time. Today, the one form of playing dead can be frequently observed with migrants' attempts to camouflage themselves by mimicking the immobility of the objects that surround them and indeed their own death to avoid detection while crossing borders. Huria Bentuhami calls this form of playing dead, of simulating anonymity and statelessness to stay alive, through techniques such as burning one's fingers to erase the fingerprint, cutting one's tongue, burning one's identity papers, and the like, thanatomimesis, or the life strike. The temporary suspension or elimination of one's signs of life in order to avoid detection resembles the advice to avoid being killed by the potential shooter on campus. By contrast, it is another form of playing dead when, as recently as in January 2026, some demonstrators dropped themselves to the ground at the parking lot of the Immigration and Custom Enforcement, or ICE office, in Medford, Oregon, to protest the Trump administration's immigration crackdown. Here, the mimicry of death reverses the logic of going undetected and seeks instead to make death visible where it is not expected to be visible. I argue that it is the latter form that constitutes the die-in as a form of resistance. Despite its growing visibility, the die-in has not been properly studied. Even though in the United States, local and national newspapers feature articles and visuals on die-ins with increasing frequency, existing scholarship on social movements contains only occasional, in-passing mentions of this tactic. In other disciplines, too, only a handful of scholars have subjected die-ins to scrutiny. A prominent example is Jose Medina, whose philosophical reflections on the epistemologies of resistance focuses on the testimonial quality of the die-in. On the whole, the relative lack of engagement with the die-in vis-a-vis other, more familiar tactics of protest tends to leave us in the dark about what work the die-in aims to do and from where it derives its force. In this lacuna, I would like to begin today by raising some elementary questions. What is a die-in? What are the qualities of the die-in that distinguish it from other forms of protest? Qualities which may shed light on why it emerges as a form of resistance. What political work does the die-in set out to do, and how does it function? Since the die-in is a relatively novel form of protest action, my goal is to take up the die-in as a political form, one that can be theorized at a remove from its immediate and contextually determined deployments, though of course informed and inspired by them. What follows is, in a sense, an exercise of abstracting from its empirical deployments an ideal type or form that can be dissected, analyzed, appreciated, and critiqued for what it can and cannot achieve. To preempt my argument, I should say that I will work genealogically and analytically to establish the die-in as a form that lies at the intersection of politics and aesthetics, a nonviolent form of corporeal performativity that is at the same time a performance. The performance duality that marks the die-in as a corporeal form can be distinguished from other protests by way of its deployment of specific logics that grow out of this duality and that help make its intervention. a logic of exposure, a logic of non-identity, and a logic of interruption. By delineating these logics, I hope to show the potentialities of the die-in as a form of contestation and thus to contribute to the political theorization of resistance in the present. Now I try to give a brief political genealogy of the die-in. The die-in is a peculiar word, so it's helpful to begin by dissecting how it is defined. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the die-in is a political demonstration in which people play dead. The dictionary further elaborates that such demonstrations are typically used to protest about an issue associated with harm or danger to life. The dictionary does not specify whether the issue being protested, one that is associated with harm or danger to life, has already claimed lives or is feared to claim lives if it were left to be unaddressed. Neither does it specify what it means to play dead. Thus, while it does not directly indicate the temporal relation of the protest with the issue at stake, these clues imply that those who are participating in the protest are not the ones who have been directly impacted by the issue, only that they are protesting the harm or danger to life entailed by a reference to lives harmed and to lives endangered, the latter of which may, of course, be referencing their own. This ambiguity has important implications for the question of who the political subject of the die-in is, which I will come back to in due course. The dictionary ties the etymology of the word to other words that use in as a suffix by derivation. Thus, immediately we see a kinship of the die-in with other forms of resistance, the most prominent of which is the sit-in. The suffix in does a lot of work in defining the forms of resistance with which it is associated, and the dictionary suggests its function to be forming nouns in combination with a verb stem, denoting a protest in which a number of people carry out the action expressed by the first element. For example, camp in, kiss in, hate in, kneel in, pray in, sew in, stand in, wade in, occasionally with the adjective as the first element. Nude in, for example. The dictionary associates the protests defined by the suffix in with the protests that were carried out by African Americans against racial segregation in the United States, tracing the first public uses of the word to a Newsweek article from 1960. I quote, "Into the already roiled waters of the South, Negroes will wade this summer in a campaign to break down segregation at public beaches, a wade-in counterpart to the widespread lunch counter sit-ins of recent weeks," the article goes. By contrast, the first recorded instance of the word die-in is traced back to a 1970 Harvard Crimson article, which reads, I quote, "The die-in will protest the noise and air pollution of the supersonic transport jets when they begin operation in the United States," end of quote. If the uses of the sit-in the 1960s clearly reference the context of the civil rights movement, the emergence of the die-in the context of protesting supersonic jets already indicates the emergent politicization of different issues, such as toxicity and pollution. Following some cross-references in the dictionary, however, leads to other interesting finds. A more colloquial version of the term die-in is lie down, which is defined as a form of protest in which participants lie on the ground and refuse to move. This term has a longer history and appears as early as 1936 in Time magazine, referencing a protest in which 12 women and 45 men picketing the Berkshire Knitting Mills in Reading, Pennsylvania, by lying flat on its ice-covered front walk, were arrested. End of quote. Sit down, which is a similar variation on the sit-in, also appears as early as 1936 in various news articles in the New York Times, which reports that the Akron rubber industry's second sit-down of the week was in progress today, and a series of sit-down strikes and sit-in protests were threatened today by the Workers' Alliance of America as a means of protesting the layoffs proposed. Another article in the New York Times from the same month offers a clarification for its readers. The latest thing in strikes is the sit down, it says. It's also called the sit in, stay in, the folded arm, or the occupation strike. End of quote. As this brief etymology shows, the die-in is a variation derived from the sit-in, sit-down, and lie-downs that can be traced back to labor militancy in the 1930s, in which participants refused to leave their factories and workplaces. These forms of resistance re-emerge in the context of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, but with a reversal of meaning. In that context, it was less a matter of protesters refusing to leave a space they had already access to than of taking up space where they were not allowed to be or wanted, such as lunch counters, buses, bathrooms, and beaches. While both forms have informed the die-in as precedents that have sought to be disruptive of established relationships and institutions, both signifying a breach of boundaries, whether by not leaving or by going to places where they're not welcome, it is the insertion of dead bodies where they're not expected or wanted that characterizes the contemporary enactments of the dying. If this etymology alone is quite revealing as an outline of the genealogy of the dying, such a discursive focus alone might give the impression that the die-in is merely a minor tactical variation derived from the lie-downs and the sit-ins. However, the die-in also has other precedents that do not have the obvious etymological connections, but instead share affinities by virtue of the commonality of interest in public representations of death and destruction. Among these, one can situate mock funeral processions as symbolic representations of death that have been utilized to generate public awareness regarding extralegal violence and its victims. As precedents, one might think of the funeral procession used in 1961 by anti-nuclear activists in Oslo against the testing of the Soviet superbomb, or the 1965 funeral procession to Montgomery, Alabama, that included 10 empty caskets to signify the dead in the civil rights struggle. In a similar way, the vigil, not only as a form of collective mourning and remembrance, but also as a form of protest action, which responds to unlawful killings, whether in war or in civil strife, must be considered as a precedent that deeply informs and shapes the dying. Prominent examples are the many vigils held by students around the US in the aftermath of the shootings on the campus of Kent State University in 1970, where the National Guard soldiers killed students peacefully protesting the Vietnam War in the midst of a nationwide student strike that involved the closure of 450 campuses and the participation of over 4 million students. Once the die-in emerges and establishes itself as a distinct political form, it quickly disseminates into different struggles. Perhaps the die-in's greatest success and deployment as a widespread form has come about in the 1980s, when it was taken up by LGBTQ activist groups such as ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, while organizing against the government's response to the AIDS epidemic and protesting homophobia. In 1987, ACT UP activists organized die-ins in major cities, especially in New York City, stopping traffic during rush hour and picking locations such as City Hall, the Wall Street, and the Food and Drug Administration, which they blamed for neglecting the AIDS epidemic and for not facilitating the testing of experimental drugs. Similar die-ins were held in other major cities and at strategic locations as part of a spectrum of direct action tactics that included sit-ins, kiss-ins, street theater, drag performances, as well as other disruptive demonstrations staged by ACT UP activists. Since the early 2000s, the die-in has been increasingly utilized by anti-war activists around the world, organizing against the United States invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, the increasing use of drones in international conflicts, and the indiscriminate killing of civilians. In 2009 and 2011, protesters, including Jesuit and Franciscan priests, retired U.S. military officials, veterans, and other peace activists were put on trial for staging die-ins at the entry points of Air Force bases in Nevada and Syracuse, respectively, where drones are remotely operated to carry out targeted killings in Afghanistan and elsewhere. These have acted as transmission belts between the anti-nuclear and anti-Vietnam protests of the 1970s and the many die-ins staged on college campuses in protest of the genocidal violence in Gaza in the last 2 years. Finally, protesters have opposed the increasing militarization of policing and police violence with high visibility die-ins in the United States most recently. These actions have connected the civil rights movement to the movement for Black lives, which has frequently resorted to the die-in as a tactic of struggle. Influenced after the 2013 acquittal of George Zimmerman, who was responsible for the killing of Trayvon Martin, the Black Lives Matter movement has used die-ins to problematize police brutality, the precarity of communities of color, and the ongoing effects of institutional and structural racism. BLM activists have resorted to staging die-ins on college campuses. They have blocked the San Mateo Bridge and paralyzed many shopping malls in big cities across the United States. While this is not an exhaustive list, I hope it gives a sense of the wide range of struggles in which different political movements have relied on the die-in to protest issues associated with harm or danger to life, as the dictionary defined it. As Ashim Membe teaches us, and as the multiplicity of harms protested suggests, that while modern politics is always already biopolitics, it is also defined by deeply necropolitical tendencies. The premium placed on survival makes life as vulnerable to violence as much as it's valuable, such that the more it is protected, the more its security is threatened. While perhaps helpful to open us up to a diverse archive of struggles, the utility of such a genealogy is nonetheless limited. There is a modularity of the die-in, as social movement theorists would call it, which remains an acknowledgement of the pliability and adaptability of the form. But it doesn't give us much in the way of substance. In other words, it offers a sense of where the die-in comes from and how it disseminates and migrates across diverse, yet connected struggles, but it doesn't offer an analysis of its allure or effectivity. To move toward a more substantive analysis of the tactic, I want to begin by highlighting some qualities that characterize it as a distinct form of action. Based on its most immediate features, the die-in is a form of protest that is both political and aesthetic. The dramatic feigning of death is often performed by a group of people who act in concert, as Hannah Arendt defined it. Their coordinated getting together and appearance in public dons their action with a political quality and with power, which Arendt carefully distinguishes from force or violence. At the same time, the collective and public performance of feigning death, in which the activists deliberately perform a role that puts them in the place of a subject position other than their own, is what makes it a primarily aesthetic or dramaturgical intervention. The action thus sits at the crossroads of politics and aesthetics, which points in two ways. On the one hand, we have the politicization of aesthetics that arises from the theatrical gesture of playing dead, where the performance of the harm offers a problematization of the act, and its performance in the form of street theater makes it a public intervention. On the other hand, there is the aestheticization of politics that arises from the problem, indeed impossibility, of representing death in politics in a way that is not simply subsumed into conceptual discourse. Insofar as aesthetics, whether through poetry, music, art, film, or theater, offers this sensory, extra-discursive way, it pushes against the boundaries of what is sayable and what counts as lived experience in the realm of the political. Another significant quality of the Dayan that I would like to highlight is that it is part of a nonviolent repertoire. Jean Sharp, whose hitherto unsurpassed work on nonviolent action offers a compendium of many methods of protest, defines nonviolent action not as action that happens to not rely on violence, but as action that actively rejects violence, which is why it is also occasionally referred to as passive resistance. There's a gradation within nonviolent action in terms of whether it's more symbolic, whether it refuses cooperation with power, or whether it actively intervenes in a situation. However, the common denominator of all tactics that come under the umbrella of nonviolent resistance is their repudiation of force as part of their political intervention. There's a philosophical background to this rejection. Jean Sharp argues that nonviolent action represents a general technique of political struggle that is based on the idea that the wielders of political power fundamentally depend on the consent of those they govern, even though this consent is also garnered and supported with the coercive power of the state. Popular consent is not only an important reason for obedience of the masses, their compliance and active cooperation with power, but it is also the basis of legitimacy for a political regime, that is, its authority. Sharp, following in the footsteps of an important lineage of thinkers from Etienne de la Boétie to Mahatma Gandhi, thus reasons that even though coercion can secure some obedience, it cannot guarantee it without the voluntary consent of the masses. This consent can be withdrawn as well as extended. Nonviolent action, then, is a display of the withdrawal of consent necessary for the regime to function, without which they would have to excessively resort to violence and thereby lose their legitimacy. The withdrawal of consent suggests that things cannot go on as before, and if successful, can initiate the transformation of social and political relations. Following Sharp's analysis, emphasizing the Dayan as a form of nonviolent resistance means to read in it the retraction of consent by those who perform it, both for themselves and more symbolically in the name of the governed. However, this move still does not say much about what that consent entails. Is it a specific law that is being contested, or is the message broader and more fundamental, as it were, suggesting the performers of resistance to say, we don't want to be ruled by this government, by these laws, in this way? Nor does the idea of the retraction of consent by those who are ruled shed light on the specific form of the retraction. For Sharp, this is not a significant theoretical issue, and the types of nonviolent action are discussed in relation to contextual factors that are implicitly mobilized to account for differences. However, this might suggest that activists choose from a menu of options, as it were, available within the repertoire of nonviolent resistance based on their desire or arbitrary preferences. Perhaps there's always an element of choice in what form of resistance is privileged. However, there are also significant differences between existing forms. The die-in is not a petition, nor a labor strike, nor a sit-in. These differences need to be accounted for to explain why one might see the preponderance of one form over possible alternatives in different contexts. This brings me to the next quality of the die-in, its corporeal nature. The die-in deploys activist bodies in public space, making them visible. In Notes Towards a Performative Theory of Assembly, Judith Butler argues, and I quote, that there's an indexical force of the body that arrives with other bodies in a zone visible to media coverage. It is this body and these bodies that require employment, shelter, healthcare, and food, as well as a sense of a future that is not the future of unpayable debt. It is this body or these bodies, or bodies like this body or these bodies, that live the condition of an imperiled livelihood, decimated infrastructure, accelerating precarity. End of quote. Attributing to the public presence of the body a role irreducible to the demands voiced in protest, Butler argues that there is an excess of signification produced by an embodied gathering that goes beyond any discursive account of such a gathering. The material assembly of bodies in public exercises a right to appear, Butler continues, which advances the demand to be recognized, to be seen, to be watched, to be witnessed. Bodily performativity, as distinct from linguistic performativity, claims a certain transgression simply by appearing. Precarity is the through line of Butler's account that brings together diverse struggles in our political conjuncture. At the same time, demands to overturn precarity are secondary to the prior act of appearing in public, which, in the very act of putting one's body on the line, already refuses disposability as the subject's defining condition. The exercise of the right to appear, then, is the enactment of a claim to the political, however partial this claim may be. Butler's emphasis on public assembly helps us move beyond a conception of politics that privileges the discursive realm, arguments and agreements, dissensions and disagreements, at the expense of mimics and gestures, singular or collective corporeal enactment. However, even though Butler underscores the importance of corporeal performativity, their account stops short of offering a differentiated understanding of corporeal appearances in public. Corporeal performativity is not the equivalent of a corporeal performance. After all, there are many ways to appear in public without pretending to be dead. Compare, for example, the die-in to a march. While the march is characterized by movement, sound, rhythm, and vocalized demands in the form of slogans, chants, and public speech acts, the die-in is characterized by a lack of movement, sound, or speech. Now consider, for example, the die-in as an alternative to the more conventional sit-ins, with all the poignancy of the semantic and symbolic effects of shifting from sitting to lying down and pretending to be dead bodies. In the one, those who are sitting in are occupying a space where they are not wanted. They claim the space as their own. They make themselves immobile and thus unmovable. They squat and do not leave when they are told to do so. In the other, those who are dying in make themselves part of the space. They become one with the ground, horizontal, silent, and immobile. But the immobility is not a declaration of the determination not to move. It is the representation of having been deprived of an ability to move, to breathe, to live, a representation that intrudes into the everyday lives of others by taking up space in roads, intersections, bridges, and official spaces. All three forms, the march, the sit-in, the die-in, can be read as asserting bodily performativity with a right to appear and a demand for recognition. However, in both the march and the sit-in, the demand for recognition is articulated by the assertion of a public presence, whereas in the die-in, the same demand is made by the representation of an absence through the mimicry of death. It is this mimicry that sits at the heart of the die-in's political intervention, and this brings me to my last point. What does it really mean to play dead or to perform a corpse? Die-ins are corporeal performances that simulate the effects of fatal violence. They linger on the boundary between life and death, not because the performers are on the verge of death, but because they stage the death of others for yet others to see. The enactment of the die-in, then, is always already a reenactment of the original, an inauthentic copy, since those who were part of the original violence are no longer alive. Every die-in is a symbolic repetition of the original violence, a repetition performed by those who act in the name of those who have been subjected to it. As such, the die-in is always a representational practice, which must reenact the impossible, the fatal result of the physical violence directed upon alterized bodies, without making that result into a spectacle for public consumption. It is a hard balancing act. Here, I want to isolate three distinct logics that the die-in mobilizes to make its political statement in that balancing act between representation and spectacularization. These are the logic of exposure, a logic of non-identity, and a logic of interruption. These three logics together characterize the corporeal performance of the Dayan as distinct from its performativity, and they reveal the potentiality of the Dayan as a form of contestation alongside the impasses of radical politics today. The corporeal performance of the Dayan assumes an expository function. It attempts to expose the violence experienced by specific bodies by staging its repetition in an exaggerated, stylized, and choreographed way, as part of a visual, often mediatized drama. As Susan Leigh Foster has convincingly argued, I quote, "The body is a vast reservoir of signs and symbols that is capable of both persuasion and obstinate recalcitrance." End of quote. The Dayan mobilizes the body to perform a refusal of complicity and compliance with power, to enact a withdrawal of consent, as it calls on the public to see and bear witness to lives unjustly taken. In so doing, it engages in an effort of retroactive folding of the action in order to name the harm reenacted as a political act of murder, of state-supported, endorsed, or perpetuated terror. It is an invitation to see this act differently, an epistemic challenge as well as political critique. It relies on bodies playing dead to make visible a hidden grammar of politics that some lives are less worthy than others, such that they are much more exposed to harm and that they can be killed with impunity. From AIDS protests to Black Lives Matter to Gaza and beyond, the Dayans expose the hypocrisy of liberal democratic orders, national or international, that are justified on the basis of human dignity and equality, while actively upholding and reproducing the unequal worthiness of human lives with their extra-legal practices of violence, partial applications of the law, and political immunity for the perpetrators. The bodies of the protesters emerge as tools of unconcealment of what happens to those other bodies, of the violence done to them, and the absent presence of those who cannot be there. Since the performer is feigning the death of another, the Dayan raises the question of the political subject, as well as the relationship of the dead body to its own representation. At stake in the Dayan is the representation of those who cannot be present, whose lives are taken. What then of the body feigning death? These are body doubles, doubles of original bodies that are lost to harm and that cannot be reclaimed. Whereas the bodies in the Dayan can get up and leave, what they leave behind is a lingering sense of absence, which they materialize both by dying in and then by getting up. But what is also at stake in this performance is precisely the representation of a non-identity. On the one hand, the performance aims to make visible the inadequacy of the one whose death is staged to the real subject of rights and liberties, who has the privileged ability of representation. Take, for example, the Dayans of students on college campuses protesting genocide. Their performance of death does not only reveal the non-identity between the anthropological standing of those who have been killed with impunity in Gaza and their own status as equal subjects of the law, as citizens of a Western democracy with the rights and liberties to appear in public, so perhaps not for long or not to be taken for granted. But it also reveals the non-identity between the systematic infliction of death on civilians as a crime against humanity and that between an ordinary act of war. Alternatively, when Black Lives Matter activists play dead, they invoke the inability of non-white life to enjoy the constitutional protections and the sanctity of life, thereby standing in for the non-identical, a particular form of life, Black life, that is not the opposite of death, but adjacent to death. What is more, the Dayan also stages another non-identity, the wedge between the death of the subject, whether it is gay death, Black Death or Palestinian death, and the public representation of that death as a non-event. In other words, by staging a symbolic or feigned death as a public event, the Dayan hints at the incommensurability between the event of deaths that are being represented and the non-event of their actual death. The final logic I want to delineate in the Dayan is that of interruption. As public stagings of death, Dayans make a critical interruption in the flow of everyday life on the street in a context defined by continuous movement. This moment of stoppage, the cessation of activity, opens up a new temporality. This is not the temporal folding forward to the future of playing dead to avoid the active shooter, nor is it the retroaction of playing dead to name and problematize the infliction of violence that has already happened. This is the temporality of the now, when time has come to a standstill, even though it is filled with potentiality, including what Walter Benjamin would call the tiger's leap into the future. As the body performs its stillness, its stoppage, and perhaps this is what Giorgio Agamben has called becoming inoperative, it refuses any kind of instrumentality and transforms the experience of time with it. The now time is one that politicizes cessation through the performance of inaction. And yet, this is an inaction that spreads. As bodies insert themselves into public spaces, they also interrupt other bodies. They stop the flow of traffic, impede transportation, obstruct passage, and force pedestrians to stop and watch, to bear witness. The insertion of the stillness in the midst of flow replicates the stillness created by fatal violence. It interrupts and thwarts the dominant temporality of repetition that characterizes life. It challenges the vitalism of movement, of circulation, and all the instrumental markers of survival and well-being, with a non-instrumental modality of political action. Non-instrumental because no amount of feigning death can bring back life, and it is dubious that it will prevent new lives from being taken. What it does do is to effect a deactivation, if only momentarily, of the hold of power on our imagination and on our solidarity. We know that that hold is most forcefully broken in constituent moments, when radical energies erupt on the stage of politics and transform what exists through a revolutionary praxis that exceeds any constituted sovereign orders. By contrast, die-ins are momentary and fleeting deactivations of power, akin to what Giorgio Agamben has called destituent power, but only in the non-mediality of the gestural forms that germinate under the shadow of sovereignty. This form of power is deeply anarchic and presents a strong contrast to constituent power, understood as the ability to create new norms and political forms ex nihilo. However, in the absence of constituent ruptures, the political aesthetics of the die-in can be read as a stylized refusal, a withdrawal from power, in this case by a symbolic annihilation. Sovereignty, after all, cannot apply to bodies that are already dead. The gestural repetition of death suggests a desire to escape its shadow, to destitute sovereign violence, which nonetheless feeds on the dead and grows all the more it kills. The die-in is not only the dramatized reenactment of a corporeal violation, it is a suggestion that we too live borrowed lives on the precipice of violence. At this precipice, in this still yet open temporality of the now, the die-in enacts the eruption of the new, of solidarity, the political value that expresses the desire not to be governed, to escape the vortex of sovereignty, and to take others along by shocking them out of their political apathy, perhaps so that they might activate their own agency in ways that they deem appropriate for the unmaking of existing society. From within its performance by inoperative bodies, feigning bodies of non-value, it is the emergence of a counter-value, which is destituent because it leaps toward what falls out of the sovereign shadow simply by ceasing its movement. Dying in is, then, as much a living out, as it goes where it's not allowed, as it inserts itself where it does not belong, precisely because it refutes that some humans do not belong, and thereby refuses the boundaries that might domesticate its humanity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bargu. Wow, a unique and pragmatic theory of the die-in. Thank you. I I think that before we open up the um, question period, I- I'd I'd love to just ask you more about your thoughts on Walter Benjamin. You mentioned a funereal process and the relation between these questions between corporeal performativity and corporeal performance are kind of nicely, in some sense, reproduced in the notion of allegory that he brings up in the Trauerspiel. Do you have thoughts on that relation?
That's really interesting, actually. I relied on Benjamin's theses on history in the conceptualization of the now time and the cessation of movement, and some of the allusions to, the general strike and the cessation of movement at the end of the Critique of Violence, where it talks about divine violence. But it hadn't really occurred to me to make the connection between what I'm talking about here and the Trauerspiel, which, now that you mention it, is very interesting and something that I need to think about further. Because, of course, that is also about a dramatized death, both symbolic and allegorical, of a kind of sovereignty, and the mourning of that, of its passing. And so that's really, really interesting. I'm going to have to think more about that and make the connection. But thank you for bringing that to
Sure, I
my mind.
love the essay. I can we open up the floor to questions for Dr. Bargu?
I can try and venture a question. Thank you so much, Dr. Bargu. That was fantastic. I was wondering, in preparation for this talk, I read Starve and Emulate, and in that book you bring up what I thought was like very interesting, the word you use, the state's monopsony of sacrifice, where I guess you sort of explain it as kind of the opposite of monopoly, where in a monopoly there's something that is only being sold by a single entity, where I guess in monopsony, it's the opposite of that, where it's like a single seller, I guess, or not a single seller, a single buyer, and you write about that in the context of I guess the Turkish state sort of being the only legitimate I guess thing to die for within its own logic. I guess I was just wondering how I guess like the performance of the performance of the die-in. I was just wondering how that would relate to that, or if a connection could be made there.
Mhm. Thank you so much for bringing that up. It's true. I in Starve and Immolate, I make this borrow this term monopsony from economic theory as a kind of different monopoly, not the monopoly of producing or offering something, a good or service, but in fact being the only buyer, being the only recipient of something that is offered. And what I mean by that is that of course, my first book is grounded in Turkey because I'm looking at a movement that emerged out of Turkish prisons around the year 2000, based on political prisoners hunger striking. But what I want to say is something more general, in fact, that for every nation state, modern nation state, um, political sacrifice for other entities other than themselves, is something unacceptable. That if you sacrifice yourself for a movement, either it will be depoliticized as an occasional death or loss of life, or it will be criminalized, or both. And the discourse that you are able to sacrifice your life for an alternative entity is already a challenge to sovereignty from the perspective of their role as being the only recipient, legitimate recipient of sacrifice. Now, to make that connection with the dying is a little bit difficult because the people who are staging die-ins are not necessarily doing it as a sacrifice. It's more of a performance of something that has already transpired. It's a repetition and a critique through repetition. So there is no fundamental challenge that they are presenting to the state on the front of dedicating their lives, sacrificing their lives to an alternative entity that is either in existence or to emerge. So, from that perspective, in the case that informed the first book, there was a genuine political collectivity that wanted to bring about an alternative political collectivity that would challenge, transform, and reconfigure the state into an alternative political community. Here, too, obviously, there is a critique. There is a strong critique about the hypocrisy of not protecting every life equally, not dignifying every life equally, making some more vulnerable, or deploying violence on some with greater impunity. But it is not necessarily in order to bring about an alternative political collectivity. And therefore, it could work out that way, but it so happens that it's generally understood within a repertoire of civil disobedience, of nonviolent resistance, that has a more transformative goal within an existing political structure. So while the attempt would be to democratize the state, I don't think it would be to necessarily replace it with an alternative. As I try to express towards the end, it's more of a negative positioning with respect to existing power structures. It's more of a temporary stopping of the operation of power rather than in a kind of revolutionary constituent movement trying to bring about something entirely new, to found something, a new mode and order from scratch. So in that sense, the connection is less strong with the performance of a die-in because it's usually not understood in that idiom of the sacrifice of life for an alternative cause.
Thank you. That's
Thank you for the question. That was great.
Shep, we do have one hand up in case you can't see the.
Great. Yes, please. Yosef, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for, can you hear me just well?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, yeah, thank you for the talk. My question would be is, on the prevalence of, I believe the term would be like astroturfing or fake uh, co-opting of movement. So the best example that a lot of people would probably know of is the activist group Just Stop Oil, where they would do die-ins or they would do big art displays, or they would do things like go into museums and chain themselves up to big public events. But the actual reasoning for this turned out to be the fact that one of the heads of Just Stop Oil was actually the daughter of a big time oil CEO, who the whole purpose of this was to actually discredit the climate movement by pushing away the normal person, by making it harder for the normal citizen to empathize with like climate action and the kinds of things that would to make it more life disrupting and make it harder for the ordinary citizen to achieve these kinds of things. With things like die-ins and stuff like that, and how I guess like co-opted everything in our society is, where we have um, different government organizations or different a lot of the times different when we're fighting against different corporations or whatnot, those corporations do have the money and the ability and organizational behavior to, um, I guess what I would say, like corrupt or disrupt these kinds of movements. So how can we make it um, more like I guess more pragmatic and more citizen friendly? Maybe that's the best way to say it. Sorry if I'm explaining it really poorly.
Well, thank you so much for that question. First of all, it's the first time I'm hearing that word that you started off with, astroturfing, you said? I didn't know that word. Was it astroturfing?
Yeah, astroturfing. So astroturfing is when um, you basically create fake grass. It comes from it's basically the best way to describe it is fake grassroots movements.
Fake grassroots movement. I
Yeah,
see.
so the government has actually done tons of astroturfing campaigns during, say, the Cold War. Like this is when it became like really famous, where you'd have these quote unquote citizen activists who would start a grassroots movement, but then 40, 50 years later, it gets declassified that that grassroots movement was actually they were like the nephews of CIA operatives, and they were told to do that.
This is very interesting. I didn't know this term at all, so I love learning something new. Thank you for that. I really appreciate that. But obviously, the phenomena that you're talking about, I'm familiar with in terms of, you know, power, whether it's the state or powerful corporations, infiltrating movements, and sometimes purposefully radicalizing them in order to lead to high risk situations, etc. So these are the deployment of counterinsurgency tactics, etc. These are not entirely unfamiliar, of course. Now, there's always this risk that movements can be co-opted, and the more successful they are, probably the more incentive to try to co-opt them. So, to be realistic and pragmatic about this is something that is perhaps inevitable. Uh, does the I guess what I'm trying to glean from your question is whether you think that there's something about the die-in that makes it more susceptible to this kind of co-optation or internal penetration and manipulation. I don't know if that was where you were
Yeah,
going.
that might be a good way
I,
to go about it. So
yeah.
like an
Mhm.
example that comes to mind that I can think of just off the top of my head, I believe this might have been in Britain. Um, but it was at least in Europe, it was like a die-in that was placed where people laid themselves across a freeway to disrupt it, and disrupt traffic. And then later on, of course, this was later found to just be like one of these astroturf kind of things where it was a co-opted movement to just by disrupting people's everyday life. By people want to go to work, people want to go to their doctor's appointment and or their dentist appointment, and then they get disrupted where I missed my doctor's appointment. Now I have to live with this pain for longer. I'm gonna feel hatred towards this movement. I'm gonna feel and it pushed a lot of people away from proper action.
I
So
see.
by co-opting these movements to disrupt normal people's lives, it pushes the everyday person away from being able to actually support movements or do any kinds of praxis.
I understand. I wonder though if without that disruption they were super supportive to begin with. I mean, it's also the case that some inconvenience in radical political matters is inevitable, and if that turns some people away, I mean, in this case, obviously, it's done with bad faith. So, of course, I understand and appreciate the weight of that. And I can see that the Dayan might become a more susceptible form because, in some ways, the costs of entry are quite low. I mean, you're not really risking a lot in every situation if you take part of a Dayan, and therefore it is more porous and more susceptible, therefore, for intervention by, let's say, agents acting in bad faith. That being said, however, I do think that some inconvenience is not such a bad thing after all, because the issues that are being protested are so much more significant than somebody being a little bit late to their doctor's appointment. I mean, we are talking about people who are unable to live. And so, if that's like the criteria, that already shows the kind of political apathy that is prevalent in that society, and that needs to be problematized even before the infiltration of those movements by these bad faith actors. So, I take your point that this can be diverted and abused and mobilized in bad faith. But I would also be careful because that's in a way a potentiality for a lot of social movements, especially those that really want to make change, because the stakes are high and this is important. And while we need to approach that with caution, and I will think about this more. I do think that it is not something that entirely corrupts the aims that staging such demonstrations, staging such performances would like to achieve. But thank you for that. I learned something, and I will definitely think more about this connection that you are raising.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Great, thank you, Yosef. Any other questions? I have a question. Banu, one of the questions you asked yourself early on was, who is the political subject of the die-in? And I began to patch together an answer for myself. And one of the places I found myself gleaning part of an answer was when you started mentioning Judith Butler and embodied excess. I wondered if you could fill in a kind of richer answer for me to that initial question, who is the political subject of the die-in? Because it blurs into a kind of anonymity, and I guess, well, this right to appear, this claiming of rights to appear. Please, if you
Yeah,
could.
thank you so much. Yeah, what I'm very intrigued by is that unlike a lot of other protests where, let's say you have a labor strike, workers go on strike, they are themselves the ones who are impacted by their labor conditions, and then they go on a strike and they perform their resistance. In the case of the die-in, it is not the actor who is impacted by the violence, but somebody else that is performing that. And it's often someone who is much more secure in their rights, who is performing that act of protest. So that non-identity for me is an interesting one, because obviously it amplifies the theatricality of it. But it also transforms the meaning of the protest, because the whole point is that those who are impacted can no longer do anything toward political intervention. Their lives have been taken. So that disjuncture between who is affected and who is in fact performing makes this a kind of advocacy action, really. And in that sense, it transforms some of the dynamics of resistance. Because I'm not saying that the people who are performing it are not taking any risks. They might be attacked by the police, they might go to jail, they might have certain repercussions, obviously. But already they're in a much more privileged position with respect to the ones that they are seeking to represent in that site. So that disjuncture is something that I try to make a little bit more visible when I ask the question, like, what is the subject? With Butler, because their theory is more encompassing about every kind of political assembly or public assembly, it could involve the labor strike, it could involve the march, it could involve the dying. Like it's much more capacious, and it doesn't discriminate between those in which one is seeking their own rights versus one is acting on behalf, in place of, in lieu of others. And that's the distinction that I try to force a little bit to get more clarity on how the die-in, the logic of the die-in operates.
Great, thank you. Other questions for Dr. Bargu? I'm happy to interject because I was thinking about an extension of the die-in a strange way, that's related to lying on a freeway. And I remember riding up Mont Ventoux a couple of years ago on my bike, and the top 3 kilometers have written the names of women who died of violence in domestic violence, and on the road as you're riding up them. And when you're going up the top of Mont Ventoux, you're driving, it's like a 12% incline, and there's usually a headwind. You read those names and you write over them as well. And I just wondered if it's a kind of die-in, and there's a kind of standing in for the problem of the die-in. I wonder if that's another kind of, I don't know, odd, strange extension of the die-in, because someone has written the names. I mean, just a an example that, I mean, obviously it's not exactly the terms of the die-in that you're describing, which are very precise, and um, but there's a kind of silencing and lack of movement there as well in simply the signing of the name, I guess.
I can see the connection that you're building between the two because, in a way, you're not expecting to see those names as you are riding
Hmm.
your bicycle, and you are not expecting to um, uh, it kind of intrudes into your space, right? The calling of the names. And I think it's an important intervention, an interruption of your flow, let's say. And obviously it's not the embodied gathering together that the die-in represents, but a similar moment can be seen, for example, when in the Black Lives Matter protests, there was a moment when protesters were saying, like, say her name, to make people who were subjected to police violence not just statistics, but actual persons with names, with
Hmm.
faces, with lives. And so I think that too is a kind of interruption and insertion of something that is very individualized. It's, there's a life there, there's a person there, into a place where you don't expect it, and it's evocative that way. Another similar form, maybe, can be thought in, the mothers of the disappeared in Argentina in Plaza de Mayo, when they wear the pictures of their children who were disappeared by the state. They make these like larger than life portraits, photographs, the last photos that they have of them before they were disappeared, and they either put them like, they're very large, so it's kind of like they wear those pictures. And another way to, or you can, I mean, also see protests in which mothers and families carry the photos of the those who were killed by state violence. Um, it's kind of like really doubling that their own presence as the presence of those who are not there, and similar to the insertion of, say their name or the names that you were seeing written along the way. So these are all instances, I think, of the same logic, and of course different forms, very specific different forms. But there's an idea of bringing to the public sphere those who cannot be there, and then problematizing why they cannot be there as something that really needs to be thought about collectively and changed. So and of course, I mean, I'm not naive about the potentiality of this. It takes extremely dedicated, long efforts to really enact a change. I mean, I don't know how many decades the mothers of the disappeared in Argentina have been protesting. In a similar fashion, mothers of the disappeared, were called Saturday mothers in Turkey, have been going week after week in the same public square in Istanbul, with the pictures of their children who were disappeared maybe 30 years ago now, 35 years ago now, and they are insisting that they be returned alive. And obviously, they also likely know that that's not even within the realm of possibility, but that gesture, the intransigence, the insistence, the recalcitrance, the not giving up, is extremely important, as is their actively, physically enacting, either by names or pictures, the presence of those who were erased or who were tried to be erased. So, from an alternative perspective, one could also critique, I think, this non-identity in the sense that obviously it is a kind of insofar as, let's say, peace movement, peace activists are carrying out die-ins, in the at the base of military bases, for example, in order to protest like drone killings, civilian killings. One can say, obviously, there is a kind of hierarchy of privilege that they are able to mobilize implicitly in order to do this in sites that are not threatened, in ways that are not going to be detrimental to themselves. And by challenging that hierarchy in the protest, they may perhaps be critiqued for, in a sense, reenacting it inadvertently, because it's built on the fact that they have the rights to protest, that they are conducting the protest to begin with. So I see that as a possible downside of this discrepancy between the political subject of the die-in and what they are actually reenacting. So it's both forceful, but it's also, I guess, open to a discussion of all of these other dimensions that need to be recognized. That it is a more privileged form of protest in a certain sense.
Thank you. Perhaps there's one more question. In wake of that, perhaps I could just ask you one other comment. You began your lecture with an incredible kind of example from your own institution of sheltering in place or playing dead, and that kind of temporal structure of metalepsis where a future becomes important is also bound up and packaged in the way you're thinking about the die-in's relationship to those who have died in the past. I wonder if you could just speak briefly about that temporal structure and the importance of those kinds of reversals of time forward and backward for your own work.
Yeah, I was very impacted by this idea of, thinking about the contrast between, trying to pretend that you are dead in order to avoid something happening to you. And as I mentioned in the paper, there are very good scholars who have thought about how, for example, migrants trying to cross borders. I'm sorry, my light goes off on its own. How migrants crossing borders, especially in a situation of high biometric technologies of detection, like infrared and all these high-tech gadgets that try to detect movement, detect life at the border at night with night vision goggles, etc. In order to avoid that and in order to continue on their path, in a sense, reenact playing dead from the active shooter situation, versus the very obvious reenactment of death that is happening or that happened in AIDS activism, anti-war activism, Black Lives Matter movement, etc. And that contrast for me was really an interesting one, and I tried to think a little bit about the temporal direction in which they are problematizing, and obviously, there's a backward-looking component to the first case, as well as there's a future-looking component of the other. So it's not like as binary as I made it to be. One can problematize why the migrant is trying to cross the border in the first place, as one can problematize, the future occurrences of uh, uh, extra legal violence. So there are elements of the past and the future in both cases, but one really um, rises to the surface in terms of being a dominant logic. And that was something that I was trying to build off of in order to distinguish um, the Dian's temporality as a sort of willful political intervention versus the other one. It's also political, the border crossing, obviously, in a different way, but it's
Mhm.
not staged, it's not carried out with the same aims in mind. So the temporality for me was a way of trying to bring that out a little bit, that contrast. I don't know if this is what you had in mind.
Yeah, no, just exactly. Thank you. Very, very nice. Very nice. And that example of the camouflaging was really kind of resonant for me as well.
Right. I mean, exactly. Like, so in one case, you're camouflaging, in the other, you're doing everything to kind of unveil and make it visible. So that has something to do also with the temporal logic. So that connection was what I was trying to bring out.
Yeah, beautiful. Beautiful. Well, Dr. Bargu, thank you very much for your time. And for those of you who are still with us, at 11 o'clock tomorrow, Dr. Bargu will do a seminar based on one of the chapters of her book. And you can contact Kate Cove for that chapter if you haven't already done so. And that chapter is on both Adorno and Horkheimer's dialectic of the Enlightenment and Steve McQueen's Hunger, which are both great things to sink your teeth into. And it's a fantastic reading. So I hope you can join us tomorrow for that. So thank you again, Dr. Bargu, and thank you for attending, all of you, and for your questions.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. And thank you for the question.